Welcome to Lawyer Business Advantage. This podcast is dedicated to helping attorneys earn more money, get better clients, and spend more time with family. I'm your host, Alay Yajnik, founder of Law Firm Success Group. Smart business guidance for small law firms begins in 3, 2, 1. And it's my pleasure to welcome back to Lawyer Business Advantage, Belle Walker, president and founding partner of Bellevue Consulting, founder of Bellevue Consulting. See, we've been talking so much, it just kind of jumps around a bit. How are you, Belle?
I'm doing great. Good to be back.
It's been all of 5 minutes since our last chat, and for the rest of you, it's been a week. Last time we talked about onboarding staff, and that was a really good case study into the impacts of not having a great process for onboarding your staff and how that can be addressed through process maps. We also talked about the episode before. We talked about law firm invoicing. And I know that's a favorite topic of many of you attorney entrepreneurs that are listening. Bill shared with us some tips and actually took us through a process map with a client where they identified a best practice for them and their firm on how to go about doing invoicing. And you can see that process map on our YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is best practices for onboarding clients. So, Belle, how did you end up kind of dealing with this as one of the many problems you address for law firms?
So, onboarding new clients has become quite a common area that I deal with because it is something that every law firm has to do. And if they want to be successful long term, probably has to do well. And yet, it is far outside the scope of what you're going to be learning in law school and honestly what you're likely to be trained on in most big law or early associate roles. So it's just not something that lawyers are used to having to think about, and yet it's a crucial element of success in a law firm's business.
Yeah, because whether the attorney is, doing it themselves, which they might be doing if they're solo, or most likely they have a staff member doing it. Now they've got to manage that person on how to do the process, which is a whole different thing entirely. And there's the reason it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart is the client experience starts, with that first call that they have, typically with the attorney. And you do all the work with the client, they sign the fee agreement, they're moving forward, and then things start to go wrong because the onboarding process isn't done well. And all that effort, I don't want to say it goes for naught, but it just, if it's seamless and if it works really, really well, the impression the client has going into an engagement with you, their level of trust with you is going to be sky high. They're going to be feeling like they're in really good hands, and they are much more likely to refer you business and be a good client and not second guess you. Whereas if they're having to catch things and kind of follow up and do a lot of pushing and pulling, now that level of trust isn't there. That sets the tone for the whole client relationship. But you actually have a specific situation, Belle, that you wanted to share with us, another case study. And so tell us a story about, what this firm was dealing with.
Yeah, so this was a firm that came to me with one of the more common sort of frustrations, pain points I hear, which is our process is inefficient. I think, I feel, but I'm not sure why or where or what's going on. And so this was a project really centered around documenting the process, primarily to understand what was happening, and then with an eye towards what could and should be happening. And so this was an employment law firm. And as you might imagine with employment law, because people move, employers and businesses come in and out, and all these complicated things, conflict of interest is not a trivial element of screening, onboarding, those early interactions with a client. And so this case study gets to highlight some of the challenges around that tricky little phrase, conflict of interest.
So their gut was that things were inefficient, and obviously hiring you takes a certain level of investment in the firm, both financially and a commitment of time. What were some of their really acute pain points, for want of a better word, that got them to say, yep, let's bring Belle in here and have her kind of look at what we're doing?
There were a couple of key pain points, but the biggest one was the number of partner hours that they were seeing go into conversations with prospects who ended up being conflicted out of actually becoming clients. And so this was a little bit of a continuing theme from last week around that expertise about knowing when and why a conversation should happen. Lawyers know how to have that conversation with the prospects, what information they're gathering, collecting, when the stage is set correctly. But what we discovered was that something was going wrong in the communication, and the lawyers were investing far more time than they felt like they should be before really having the confidence that this was a case that they could move forward with.
Was there a number or some kind of sense for how much of their time was being spent, and or was being they thought wasted?
Uh, I don't think we actually did have a number on that. It was more anecdotal, but sufficiently large numbers that they wanted to investigate it, and was driving that pain. So this was, I
Yeah.
think, less about saying it's this percent and it should be lower, and more just noting this shouldn't be happening at all.
Yeah, and it
This is
probably
a
gets really obvious when the attorney is sitting there talking to a prospect and realizes like 2 minutes into the conversation, this is a complete waste of my time. Why am I even talking to this person?
That I think actually would have been preferable. What was happening was they were spending an hour or more talking to the person, and then after that conversation, being informed by the staff, okay, we have confirmed we cannot actually take this
Oh,
case.
so this
There's
really
a conflict.
was a conflict issue. And so they would find out way late in the game that there was a conflict.
Yes.
Ah, okay. All right. So we just ran conflicts earlier, right? And that was done, and that was the end of the conversation.
Well, you would think. And so this is part of what I love about process mapping. And in the last two conversations, one of the steps of my process that has come up is I interview, I draft the process maps, and then we review them. And those reviews, I will say, never, ever do you go straight from the interviews to a perfect process map. That's part of the point. But in this particular case, what I was noticing was that this conflict of interest box kept bouncing between two different locations on the process map. And lo and behold, it was on either side of a conversation that was happening with the partner. And so
So,
I
so
can,
let me
yeah.
back you up here a little bit. When you say bouncing back and forth, what do you mean by that?
I mean that I would bring a draft of the process map to the staff to review, and we would iterate, and they'd get very confident about how everything should be, and then bring a draft to the partners to review, and they would point out discrepancies or concerns. This is making it sound like there were many rounds of iteration. There weren't that many rounds of iteration, but what I noticed was that even with the staff, every time usually you do some iterations, or you go through one review, you make some changes, and on the next pass there might be one or two things that need to change, but
Right,
they're new
right.
and different.
Yeah,
What was happening here was we would review, conflict of interest box would move, some other changes would be made. On the next review, conflict of interest box would move, and maybe some new iterations or new changes would take
weird.
place.
So was it that they kept changing the process or that they didn't know the process and just kept getting themselves confused? Or there were two camps, like some people did it this way and some people did it that way.
None of the above.
Oh,
It turns
okay.
out that there were actually two different conflict of interest checks that needed to happen uh, for this particular type of law firm. And so what was happening was we had one term, this phrase, conflict of interest, being used to describe two separate process steps. And so what we eventually figured out should be happening was that when the prospect initially called and gave the bare bones skeletal details to the staff members, they did a conflict of interest check, right? They would run through the database, look for company names, look for human names that were listed, etc. Then the partners would, or associates, but often the partners would have a conversation with the, assuming that conflict of interest check was passed, they would
Right.
have a deeper conversation where they would learn a lot more about the specific type of issue at hand. And the partners believed that because there had been a conflict of interest check, this was now like really worth the time, worth the investment, focusing on all of the things the lawyer needed to know. But they were also collecting additional information about the broader scope of parties involved that informed a deeper conflict of interest check that was happening
Mm.
afterwards. And so what we actually needed to do was to, one, identify and separate those two conflict of interest checks and note one was a high level screen and then one was a final sort of formal conflict of interest check, and then also separate the partner time investment so that it was very clear up front that the partner was screening still with an eye towards, can we take this case, and then having a separate deeper conversation around, okay, what exactly would go into the fee schedule? How exactly do we want to structure this engagement? Which is a different conversation than who are you? Who are you
Right.
fighting with? What's going on?
Right. That's really cool. So that makes that whole process a lot more efficient because the attorney's time is backloaded until after both conflict checks are done.
Exactly. It does, as happened on that very first case study, result in a process that has more boxes, right? It looks like you have overcomplicated, not overcomplicated things. It looks like you have added complication and potentially also inefficiency into your process when in reality you are, as you said, increasing the efficiency because you're putting less time in upfront until you have that higher confidence.
Wow. That's really wild. And I can see why that would become really apparent on a process map and in those conversations. So thanks for laying all that out. So once you went in and you showed them the new process map and they approved it, what impact did it have on the firm in addressing that issue?
A couple different things, external and internal. Internally, the partners were feeling that their time was being better respected because they were not running into that situation where
Right.
they did the deep dive and then got conflicted out. The staff felt better respected as well because, unsurprisingly, the partners were annoyed when the staff would come back from that second check and say, "Hey, there's an issue." Staff felt like they were doing their job exactly as they had been taught and expected to do it. So they felt more appreciated. And the prospect experience was also much better because we tend to focus on the lawyer time and their investment and their cost, but the prospects also had to put their time in, even if they weren't paying for that time. Now they had to go through that whole conversation with a
Right.
whole new firm. So this was a case where pretty much everyone was winning.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like a really awesome example of how a process map really highlighted some things. In this case, people were calling two things by the same name and they both needed to be done. And it was creating a lot of confusion and a lot of misplaced effort.
This was also a case where we had an opportunity to head off exactly the issue that we talked about last week. Because all one of the things that was happening was that the staff who were doing these checks were very experienced and long tenured, and they knew that both of these things had to happen. We were having it took a couple iterations on the process map to figure out what they were talking about for me because conflict of interest sounded like one phrase, so I put it in one box. But this was not a gap in the staff's knowledge or expertise. And if the staff members who had understood this had left and then we had to backtrack all of this and figure it out, I can guarantee you it was way less painful to sort this out with their support and their help than it would have been to throw someone brand new into this process and try and uncover what they were supposed to be doing around the conflict of interest check.
Totally, totally makes total sense. That's really cool. And yeah, last week we talked about onboarding staff, and so that fits right into it. Um, so as you kind of take a step back and you look at the work you've done with law firms, just in what we've talked about, um, firms have benefited from process maps on the invoicing side. They've benefited on onboarding their staff. We're now showing how they've benefited onboarding clients as well. Um, I guess, what do you think is going on with law firms to the point where they're not able to have these process maps already done for them?
Well, there's a couple of things here. It's a little bit intentionally understand, but a little bit of a loaded question, implying that this is something lawyers should know how to do or should be capable of doing, or that it's even the best use of their time. And I specify their time, not someone's time. Um, because this is not something that's covered in law school. This is not something that's core legal expertise. And I certainly would not want to try and do the lawyer part of a business. And so I think a lot of what's happening is that this is something that is fundamental to the business part of running a law firm. And so it's something that they haven't been trained on. And it's a tool, honestly, that a lot of even business professionals may or may not be familiar with. So
I
it's
think,
sort of piece A. Oh, good.
no, I'm just gonna say that part really resonates with me, which is why I jumped in. Um, Attorneys know they weren't trained to run businesses and all of that. Um, but I would think, gosh, can't this be built into practice management software or something like that? Like, you shouldn't need to have to go out and find you, Belle, and bring you in to do a process map. Like, this stuff should be kind of out of the box for the most part. And and that point makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think that right, even if there was or is, and there are certain project management tools that do actually integrate well with the concept of process mapping, but being physically able to create, you can do it in PowerPoint, right? Process mapping in PowerPoint is perfectly reasonable, perfectly straightforward. The challenge isn't the ability to draw the ovals and the diamonds and the rectangles that I was talking about. It's knowing which questions to ask, knowing what things need to actually be captured. Formulating yes no questions in a sequence can feel very pedantic. You're like, okay, there's three things, just know which of the three things, but really keeping that discipline around the yes no questions, so there's one question for each of those options, makes a big difference. So that gets then also into the, is it the best use of the lawyer's time when you say what's going on with them that they don't have this? I would argue probably not, right? It's a whole skill set, it's a whole separate expertise. And lawyer time is limited because all our time is, and lawyer time is expensive. And so even though there are real gains from having this type of documentation, I would almost argue that if someone in a law firm is going to do it, asking staff to look into it is often a better efficiency approach. You then also get into the questions around what is your staff trained to do? Where's that expertise? So I don't think it's a shortcoming or a surprise to me. I think this is more of a secret weapon type thing. Hey, now you know about it, you can get access to it. This is going to give you an edge and a lead versus something that, for better or for worse, is a basic.
So we were really honored to collaborate with you at Law Firm Success Group, and you came up with some generic process maps for us to use. And it's really interesting because when we routinely share that with clients, they say, yeah, that's mostly what we do, but ours is a little bit different. And that's the other part of it too, is if you have a standard set of process maps, every firm's going to run probably a little bit differently. And so you got to make changes, and then what changes do you have to make, and then they don't know how to make those changes, so then you get into that whole situation. But secret weapon is well put, and we're delighted to have you in our arsenal, Belle. So thanks for all the great work that you've done for our law firm Success Group clients as well.
Awesome. And thank you so much for having me for these conversations and supporting your clients. I actually love learning about all those little differences of what this firm does different from that firm. Sometimes it's not maybe the best practice that will serve them well over the long term, but often those differences are the little things that make certain clients want to work with those lawyers, that do distinguish them, that are part of what makes their practice special. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's fun.
I love that you love that, and we can geek out on this stuff all day because I really enjoy talking about process and systems too. Um, but what are you looking forward to with regards to Bellevue Consulting over the next year or so?
I'm really looking forward to building our capacity in this type of process mapping support and work. And I think I already gave this answer sometime in the last couple of weeks. But it's true that this is a skill set that's out there that's not commonly found in law firms, but can really benefit them. And so building out my team at Bellevue Consulting and having the ability to support more clients in exploring their processes, finding the special key elements, and maybe streamlining some of the rest. I'm very excited about doing that for more people.
Fantastic. And if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Few best ways to reach me are my website and LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, I'm Belle K. Walker, E on the end of Belle, and on my website is Bellevue Consulting, BELLEVIEW, like my view of the world, consulting.com.
Awesome. And that's Belle Walker, president and founder of Bellevue Consulting. Thank you, Belle.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Lawyer Business Advantage podcast. One thing that would really help both us and other new potential listeners is for you to rate this show and leave a comment in iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you tune in to listen. And I want to hear from you, so connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know what you think of this episode. And if you are a solo or an owner of a small law firm, and you're looking to earn more money, attract better clients, or reduce your stress, we would love to talk with you to see how we can help. Request your free law firm assessment by visiting lawfirmsuccessgroup.com. Again, that URL is lawfirmsuccessgroup.com. We look forward to talking with you soon. Thank you for listening. My name is Alay Yajnik. Until next time, remember, you can seize freedom, you can embrace happiness, you can build your perfect practice.